We are back to talk about an infamous compromise.
Yeah, there's a reason this one is in blue. Anything in blue on these slides is because it has been changed by a later amendment. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So where shall we start?
Uh, I guess first, they're not even counting the Indians at this point.
They're not counting that. Well, Indians not taxed, which the history of Native American representation and voting rights and so forth in the United States is a huge conversation that I am not qualified to have. I do not have nearly enough knowledge on that subject to speak intelligently about it, other than to say it's screwed up.
Yeah, if anybody out there can make a reply to this video and respond to this video and knows more about it, feel free to respond to this video by either doing a TikTok stitch, a reply on YouTube, or whatever is up, or Instagram, whatever we got upload this video to it in the future.
Yeah, because I've studied a little bit about it, but I know that I know both more than the average person and not enough to speak intelligently about it.
But the main thing about this thing is in the last line, the 3/5 compromise.
The 3/5 compromise. And I've got more to say about this sentence than just the 3/5 compromise, but the 3/5 compromise is infamous for a reason. Because, wow. Now, I can tell you exactly the thought process that led to this compromise. Because even though the word never appears in the original text of the Constitution, all other persons is as close as we get to the word slave. But slavery was one of the single most debated issues in the Constitutional Convention. There were passionate, rabid abolitionists. There were slaveholders who had literally hundreds of slaves. And there was everything in between.
Sorry, at this point, if I might be wrong, I believe even some of the places up north still had slaves at this point.
Yes.
It wasn't a strictly south-north divide.
Yeah, no, it was increasingly a south-north divide, but it was not yet fully a south-north divide. And it's worth noting, I don't remember his name, but I remember I read a full book about the Constitutional Convention many, many years ago that had a lot of fascinating details in it. And one of the things it said was that the largest slaveholder in the entire Constitutional Convention, he owned something like 300 human beings. And he also gave the longest and most impassioned speech against constitutional support of slavery.
And I think you mentioned that in the last video too.
Yeah, probably, because it's such fascinating information. Like, that is, yeah, it's errant hypocrisy, but he seems to have been aware of his own hypocrisy and was trying to come to terms with it.
Was he a northerner or a southerner?
He was a southerner. He was, I believe, from one of the Carolinas. And there's this, it's, I probably said this last time too. There's a line in 1776. Towards the end of the play, they are editing the Declaration of Independence prior to ratifying it and signing it and sending it out. And they're going through and they're cutting things from the original document. If you compare Thomas Jefferson's original text to what you learned in school, there are a fair few differences. And one of the biggest, most notorious ones, and it leads to the single best song in the entire musical, I Will Die on This Hill, is Jefferson blames George III for the persistence, at the very least, of slavery. And this is not fair to George III. Thomas Jefferson was a complicated man and was morally opposed to slavery while at the same time fully benefiting it. And there's the Sally Hemings situation, and it's a mess. Thomas Jefferson was a very, very messy man who this does not excuse anything, but it's an interesting historical footnote, may have actually been autistic. And there's this line. And one of the Southern delegates who's he's so wonderful in it. He's from South Carolina. I'm pretty sure it's South Carolina that was the lead, and North Carolina kind of did what was expected of them by South Carolina, at least in the musical. He's played by the wonderful John Cullum. And he refuses to let this sentence stand in the document. And he sings the magnificent song Molasses to Rum to Slaves, about the triangle trade and about, in part, how the North does not have clean hands in the slavery issue. Yeah. And after this song and after this whole debate, they're trying to persuade John Adams to let the sentence be struck, or the clause, because it's not, I don't think it's even a whole sentence.
Because like what Thomas wrote, it wasn't the final draft. He got edited a bit.
Right. And there's probably 15 minutes of the musical that's just people trying to get things cut out of the Declaration of Independence before they'll ratify the stupid thing. It's very funny, except for this one bit, which is horrific. And John Adams says in one of the quotes from the musical that is a direct quote from history, that history will judge them for not dealing with the slave issue. And everyone thinks that the line is inserted and made up for Adams, but it's not. It's a direct quote. What is changed is that John Adams predicted that it would be 80 years and there would be a civil war on the subject.
80.
80 years. Yeah. John Adams wasn't right to the exact year, but he was right by rounding error about when there would be a war over slavery. So they knew. Everyone at the convention knew that this issue was going to have to be dealt with sooner or later. And everyone at this convention was determined that it would not be by then. Yeah. Because the same reason they cut that line from the Declaration of Independence, you have to in order to keep having this country hold together. The South would have pulled out of...
A little bit earlier.
Yeah. They would have pulled out in 1776 if the line hadn't been cut from the Declaration of Independence. They would have pulled out in 1789 if slavery had not been in some way enshrined in the Constitution.
And we'll
the South was very, very firm that they were keeping their slaves.
So we'll get to that line a little bit, but here we go with the first line: representation and direct taxes.
Yeah. It's worth noting that technically there weren't direct taxes applied at this point, and that didn't happen until we get into the amendments. Because it's not until the income tax gets established later on that we have direct taxes.
But the taxes would be I think taxes are only at the state level at this point.
Yeah.
Maybe lower too, but highest it was at the state level.
Yeah. So representatives are according to their respective numbers. Proportional representation. This was the result of that big compromise. The large states got their way. They get direct proportional representation. It's in the less important House, historically speaking, but they're going to get it.
So I guess southern states here, maybe some northern states too, because they, again, at this point, more state. I don't know if even the upper northwest states had northeast states had slaves still, but it was still a thing. But I think they're like, hey, we have all these extra people here that are working for us.
Yeah.
Did they count too?
Virginia and South Carolina are the two big states that are pushing this because they are big states and a lot of their population is enslaved. That is what is happening here.
Was there more slaves than actual voter people then?
Not yet.
Okay.
It would happen, but it had not happened yet.
Okay.
So there were, because pretty much everybody at this point still believes that slavery is eventually going to die a natural death.
Because I think this is 89, so this is 4 years before the invention of the cotton gin.
Yeah. And the cotton that was grown in the United States held very tightly to the seed. A lot of people may not actually know what a cotton gin is. Like, they've heard the term, but they don't know what a cotton gin is. So what a cotton gin does is it removes the seed and it's kind of like carding in wool to separate the fibers a bit more. And it made cotton a wildly more valuable crop than it had been. And that had a lot of influence on what would happen over the years to come. At this point, most slave labor in the United States was growing rice, was growing indigo, to a certain extent was working in factories. There were slaves who were, trained in all sorts of professions. Slave blacksmiths were far from uncommon. But cotton was not grown on any kind of commercial level the way it would be because of the kind of cotton that grew in the United States. And this gets into agricultural stuff that I have learned several times and I'm apparently incapable of remembering. But I do know that the big stumbling block with cotton initially was the seeds. And what the cotton gin did was it cleanly and easily removed the seeds with far less labor than hand removing the seeds took. The next big development would be the spinning jenny, which helps to spin cotton thread, and the Industrial Revolution, and that would mostly be up north, and that would mostly be very, very low-paid workers instead of actual slaves. But the next big development that would hit the South in cotton production would be a system to actually pick cotton. Because picking cotton is a hugely labor-intensive job. And once cotton was being produced on industrial levels, the need for slaves skyrocketed because you needed all of those people to pick your cotton. And it was either slaves or pay wages, and slaves were cheaper.
Now, from what I remember in school, again, I might have been taught wrong, because we learn more things as time goes on, but that the slave states won the representation, but the taxes Not so much.
Yeah. Taxation was a really big conversation in the
we did fight
1700s.
we did fight a war over it.
We did fight a war over it. And, the thing is it's not like we were, in so many words, paying our taxes before the war. Like, the number of smugglers in pre-1776 U.S. colonies, just enormous. We did all kinds of things to avoid paying our taxes. What we were objecting to was they were imposed on us without representation.
And that's probably even before the 7-year / French and Indian War was the catalyst for all this stuff.
Yeah. No, there's a whole bunch. The history of taxation in the United States is weird. But the slave states were very, very firm that slaves were people when it counted for representation and property when it counted for taxes.
And North were like, no.
Yeah, the northern states were not playing that particular game. And they didn't want slaves to count as people for representation, but they did want them to count as people for taxation.
But isn't there a thing called counts property? Don't they have property taxes? That's nothing then.
That was a regional thing. Like, taxation in the early United States varies a lot by where you live. And that's another one where I know more than the average person, but not enough to speak intelligently.
So one time it was like North was like, hey, they're either property or they're people, not property.
Yeah, they cannot be both. And so this compromise was a way to limit the representation that slavery gave the southern states, but at the same time, raise the amount of taxes theoretically being levied on those same southern states. So it's an odd number, and I'll admit to not entirely knowing how they got to the number that they did. But slavery had been contentious for about a century at this point. Slavery was actually banned in Georgia in the 1730s.
It wasn't Georgia supposed to be like a prison state or prison colony or something?
Yes, it was originally a prison colony. He was apparently James Edward Oglethorpe, who founded the colony, was apparently afraid that the Spanish would collude with runaway slaves in order to overthrow their territory, and he didn't want the population of Georgia, which was mostly criminals, to have the same planter class structure as the Carolinas. So initially, slavery was banned in Georgia, but apparently this is where Jefferson got his whole, and then he forced slavery on us, because it was decided that the colonies couldn't pass that kind of law on their own.
The line it says, including those bound to service. Those are indentured service. Indentured service.
That's indentured service. Yeah. Which is another thing we don't have anymore that would have really influenced what childhood looked like, because most indentured servants were teenagers.
I guess we have. I guess now that it's more like an apprentice and a trade. They kind of have them, but not really.
Kind of like an unpaid internship, really. But you were a slave for a number of years.
But unlike the actual slaves, you will eventually get your freedom and have a career to go into.
Your children were not themselves slaves if you were an indentured servant who gave birth to a child during your servitude. But you were there. I mean, there were stricter limits on indentured servitude because the people would go on to be free. But it was basically short-term slavery in a lot of ways. But they count as whole people because they will be free.
I think we brought this up a little bit beginning, but it says excluding Indians not taxed, so some of them were taxed.
Yeah, again, this is one of those things where I know a little bit, but not enough to have a whole conversation about.
All right. All right. Anything else you want to go over?
No, that's it.
All right. And so far, this has been our longest topic we talked about.
Well, there's a lot to say in this one sentence. There's a lot of history that comes directly from this sentence.
Yep. Oh, and this was over. Was it the 14th Amendment that overturned this?
Yes.
We'll be getting to that in a long while.
Yeah.
But we'll see you in the next part.